Welcome. My name is Dr. Michael Fuller. I'm glad that you can come today and sit in my library and talk about the history of Chile. I did this lecture on the Viking Jupiter just 3 or 4 months ago when I was cruising from Argentina to Chile, which is a wonderful cruise. And I'll be doing it again in 2023. So it's one of my favorite routes and one of my favorite iconic lectures to give. On this map of Chile, prepared in 1635, we see the mountains, we see the coast, and we see all the compass rosettes showing the different ports that the Spanish ships were making to. I like this map because it actually has the word Chile spelled 2 different ways, C-H-I-L-I and C-H-I-L-E. And I don't know about you, but when I see the word or hear the word Chile, I think of lunch. I think of spiced meat and beans. And in fact, the chili pepper originated in the area of Bolivia and Chile, 7000 BC. Now, is the country named after chili peppers, or is it named after the ancient Inca word that basically means place that's too cold? Well, I'd like to think it's named after the chili peppers. In fact, chili peppers were a mainstay in the Aztecs' diet, and that's where we get the word chili moving into Spanish up in the area of Central and North America. Let me zoom in on this map for a second, show you a couple of interesting things. Volcanoes. Over 500 of them have been counted by geologists. And the map maker here just sort of put them all in sort of randomly. He didn't map each individual volcano, but he did show a couple of them that were erupting. In fact, right now in the country of Chile, there are 36 active volcanoes, which means they are rumbling, they are erupting. And the government of Chile is constantly moving villages and roads and to try to keep people safe from volcanic eruptions. Let me show you another portion of this map that I really like. I like the sea serpents down there. Now, if you go on a Viking Jupiter cruise with me along the coast of Chile, you won't see sea serpents. But I'll tell you what you will see, whales. And indeed, early map makers were utterly flabbergasted when sailors were telling them about these sea creatures bigger than the ships that were swimming along the coastline. And indeed, you will, during certain times of year, see whales migrating along the coast of South America. And so that was a bad representation of a couple of whales there in the water. Let me tell you something else I really like about this map. If you look up towards the upper center, you'll see Santiago de Nuevo Extremadura. And this would be the capital city of modern-day Chile, which had been an Inca outpost of the Inca Empire. It's as far south as the Incas were able to push their control and domination. Last thing I want you to recognize on that map is the word, it's sort of split in two, Mapuche. Now, it's got an O on it, but generally when it's pronounced by the nation of the Mapuche Indians, it's got an I to it. And this was one of the most powerful nations of all the Native American peoples. The Mapuche were so powerful that they were able to repel for generations Incas as they tried to dominate the area. And they were able to repel for several generations the Spanish as they tried to control the area of Chile. And today, the Mapuche are not extinct. They are very much a live, large population. I kind of like to think that anytime you see a Native American population whose name ends in the chi sound, like Apache, Comanche, Wasage, that means very tough warriors. Because, now they'll say it means people, but honestly, when you begin to find tribal groups that identify themselves with that last name, the Chi, the Mapuche, great warriors. I'll tell you more about them in a second. So I'm going to talk about the scene, the stage of where Chile is, what we know about it, the Spanish conquest and colonization, the power struggles and wars, from backwater to economic leader. My specialty, by the way, is in the pre-Spanish, pre-conquest time period and the early conquest. And so you'll hear me tell you some of those stories, a little more detailed than the others. So right now, the land mass of Chile is roughly equal to the state of Texas. And it's got a population of 7.8 million, of which a little under half of that population lives in the city of Santiago. It's a highly urbanized population in terms of there are rural communities and villages, but most of the population concentrates in cities, not only in Santiago, but Valparaiso and other cities. Now, the GDP, the per capita, is $24,500 per person, which is richer than Argentina and significantly richer than Brazil. So in terms of how things are going economically in Chile, it's one of the best off of all the South American countries. To me, it's also quite fascinating because there's an island far off the coast of Chile called Rapa Nui. You may know it by the name Easter Island, which, by the way, Viking cruise ships, sometimes on the World Cruise, try to stop there. The ocean conditions are difficult to stop at Rapa Nui, so sometimes we simply sail around it and wave and take pictures, but it's one of the most remarkable places, as you might imagine, for people interested in archaeology. More about it in a minute. As an archaeologist, I've got to tell you, there's an interesting site in Chile called Monteverde, which was discovered, of all things, by an American college professor. Tom Delaney from the University of Illinois was teaching in Chile in 1977, and his students encouraged him to come out onto some farmland they owned and conduct an excavation. And as he was excavating, he found stone tools, he found preserved carbonite materials, he even found human footprints. Now, I know you think I probably need psychiatric care, but that is a right footprint. It really is. The heel is down at the bottom, the toes are up there at the top of the photograph, and it's got a nice arch to it. As Tom Delaney was excavating there, he found that there were probably tent-like structures made out of animal skins. He found the remains of wild potatoes, edible seeds, fruits, berries, mastodon bones, it's an Ice Age elephant, paleo llamas. In fact, he found bones of anything that could be caught and eaten. These were early Ice Age populations who were coming down along the coast of the Pacific Ocean. You can see that route there, all the way down to the very tip of South America. For years, many archaeologists debated with Tom Delaney as to whether his evidence could be accepted or not. And now we've got many other sites, multiple sites showing up in Canada, in the United States, and in South America to prove his interpretation of the very earliest settlement. In fact, one layer is 16,500 BC, but Tom Delaney likes to point out there's a layer 31,000 BC of artifacts and materials at this very early site in the Americas. Another really important archaeological site in Chile is up in the area of the Atacama Desert in the northern end of the country. And it is a site, Pucara del Quintor, San Pedro del Atacama. This is a site that falls in what archaeologists call the late intermediate period. Boy, aren't you glad there's not a pop quiz in this class, right? It's a time period that fits between, we call it the middle horizon, the Moche culture, and then the late horizon, the Inca culture. It was a time when there was still a lot of dynamic things happening. And these people are building dry-laid masonry walls in a pretty complex urban area. From surviving records and oral histories, we know that this site was one where there had been a great lord, a Chiqua, and that he governed a number of gentlemen, Pixla, as well as vassals, and all the way down to llanes, domestic servants. And we can learn something really interesting about the religious traditions, legends about these people. They claimed that their supreme deity was the moon, who they named Si, S-I. And they believed the moon was responsible for weather and agricultural productivity. She was considered more powerful than the sun for a curious reason. That is, you can see the moon both at night, but also during the day. But the poor sun is so weak, he only governs the sky for half of the day, and then he has to hide at night. They believe that eclipses, the people who lived in this archaeological site, they believe that eclipses represented the battle between the gods, the sun and the moon, and that a lunar eclipse was bad luck, but a solar eclipse was good luck. How about that? We need to let the Viking resident astronomer know that story. Now, in the history of Chile, as the power of the Incas grew in Cuzco, they attempted to extend their power into Chile. And they found that there was a large, fierce population called the Mapuches. Those are the ones I showed you on the map, who put up such a resistance that it took generations for the Inca to finally be able to defeat them. And the Inca came down with far better military equipment. You see an Inca warrior on the right-hand side holding up a shield, and he has a sling stone. He's slinging rocks at the Mapuche, who are advancing in a battle line with their spears ready. And what the Incas discovered was while they had superior weaponry, they could never muster as many men to a battlefield as the Mapuche could. And the Mapuche, one battle lasted over 3 days, defeated and virtually annihilated an entire Inca army. What does that tell you about these people? Mapuches were fierce warriors and defiant to lose control of their land. They were that way with the Incas, they'd be that way with the Spanish also. So there are many indigenous people. The Mapuches, we see a representation of 3 Mapuche women there in the lower right-hand side. But then there are these interesting other populations, the Siknam, the Takuch, the Amara, the Yamana. And let me just talk about 2 of these in a little more detail. This photograph here of Mapuche women, taken in the early 1900s, show 3 women who are doctors. They are medicine women. Oh, anthropologists, we like to call them shaman, particularly when you see them holding those drums and those drumsticks. Around the world, women or men using drums as forms of divination, as forms of healing ritual, a well-known phenomenon, tracing definitely back into the Deep Stone Age. And it's interesting that in Mapuche culture, it is women who are considered the most significantly powerful in terms of being able to divine the causes of illness or misfortune, and to be able by song and ritual and herbs to heal what is injured. And so we have 3 Mapuche doctors, women doctors, who are, one of them, I like the lady in the middle who has a smile on her face, each with their own unique drum, each with a division of the quadrants of the universe, the cardinal directions, and the spirit forces that they draw from in each of those for healing. So everybody wants to know about this picture. And this is another indigenous population from the modern country of Chile. This is called the Siknam, also called the Ona. And they were a nation that lived right down in Terra del Fuego. They lived at the very southern end. But they did not wear these outfits every day. This represents adult men who are wearing a ceremonial costume in which they have this giant mask that they wear over their heads, and then their body is naked. And they have been painted with red ochre and iron oxide. And then they have dabs of white clay that have been painted onto their bodies. As they explained it to the missionaries and to the early ethnographers, this costume, not much of a costume, is it? But this costume was worn in rituals in which young men were initiated from being teenagers into being adult men. And the adult men of the community would put this costume on, and they would speak to the young men and explain to them their religion and their way of life. these folks, the Siknam or the Ona, the men believed that they were related to the sun god, and that only the sun god should receive prayers and offerings from their men, while the women were considered to be worshiping of the moon and then a variety of other spirit beings. It's an interesting culture. The women told the men that they controlled the whales, and if the men did not bring adequate fish and meat to the women for cooking, they would order the whales to eat the men when they were out in their canoes on the ocean. Curious culture, to say the least. The Siknam or the Ona became in conflict with Chilean settlers as they began to move into the area of Tierra del Fuego. And as they lost more and more of their land for hunting and agriculture, they found themselves starving. And so they began stealing sheep from the Chileans. And the punishment for stealing sheep was death. And so this population, by disease, by starvation, by actual genocide, disappeared over 100 years ago. And we have just these interesting photographs of them and the stories about them. All right, Spanish conquest and colonialization. There are our 3 Mapuche doctors, by the way, drumming away and singing. So the first person to come through the area of Chile was Ferdinand Magellan, which is the English pronunciation of his name. You'll find it pronunciated slightly different in Portugal as well as in Chile. He sailed the Victoria, and he managed to find a way to go around, to avoid going around the very tip end of South America, because that very tip end down there at Staten Island and at Santiago, that's very rough water. And I've been through that water and around the edge of Cape Horn. And when Magellan was able to find a way to pass through without going through the difficult edge of the end of the continent, well, that was a great moment. Magellan, by the way, would be traveling through there on the ship. He would not make it back to Portugal. He would die from a poisoned arrow on a Philippine island of Mactan in 1521. But his sailors would come back, and they would have his maps, they would have his measurements, and they would be able to prove that he had sailed all the way around this area. So the key players, we had Magellan, who establishes the ability to sail and establish colonial outposts on the coast of Chile. We have Almagro, Diego de Almagro, who decided that he would be hiking across the Andes Mountains from Peru to the area of Chile because he was sure that there would be great wealth there. It was a big mistake. He lost most of his men from cold and starvation. And then when he got out of the Andes Mountains, guess who he ran into? The Mapuches. And they battled fiercely against him, pushing him back up into the Andes. He came up with no gold. He came up with no silver. He came up with just simply a huge amount of loss of men trying to come to this area. It'd be Pedro de Valdivia, who was a much smarter Spaniard. He would cross the Atacama Desert to get to the area of Chile versus going over the Andes. And from there, he would come down the coast. He would go inland. He would found the city of Santiago, named after the great Spanish shrine of Santiago de Compostela, which never fell to the Moors. But to his mind, for the amount of energy and work he expended, it was almost worthless compared to the riches of Peru and Bolivia. So the creation of Santiago de Nuevo eventually would be named Extremo versus Extremurdo. Extremurdo was another Spanish city that they were saying, giving it honor to. They eventually said this is Santiago, the new and most distant, the most difficult. Founded in 1541. And even by the Spanish recorders themselves, they said it was a poor and dangerous place. Why was it dangerous? Because the Mapuches and other populations were right around it. You see, it's on Rio Mapucho, right? And it was indeed a place where it was difficult to maintain defense and to create what was going to be a very successful, worthwhile community. It would be a backwater also because not only was there the constant conflict with the Mapuche, but because the Spanish really were eager to either come up with lots of gold or lots of silver, things which they were getting out of Peru, getting out of the Incas, getting out of the tombs of the Moche, for example, that beautiful Moche mask. And Chile just did not have those kinds of mineral resources. Well, how do you govern a country that's actually not tremendously wealthy and in sort of constant upheaval with these pretty fierce populations of native peoples who were not eager to be colonized? Well, you have a series of viceroys being appointed. And one of the viceroys, with a very un-Spanish name, was Ambrosio O'Higgins. And he would be given the job of leaving Peru and coming down into Chile, establishing settlements, building forts, and putting in gun emplacements. And there would be a series of 10 cities that he would be responsible for creating. 7 of those cities would be, guess what? Literally destroyed by the Mapuche and other populations who were not eager to see a permanent Spanish community established. O'Higgins would eventually discover that maybe things would be a little better if he wasn't using some of the old conquistador methods of dealing with the native peoples. The idea of encomienda, forced labor by populations, was something that he would eventually decide to abolish, hopefully moving it to a situation where there could be a collaboration between the Spanish populations and the indigenous peoples. So Jose Miguel Carrera would actually formally end the concept of slavery in Chile. He would also abolish the title nobility and end many of their legal prerogatives and privileges, created the first free newspaper in the country, and actually began to move the country of Chile away from being simply an arm of Spain, but to be an own independent country. How did Spain feel about that? Well, that's nothing they wanted to see happen. And so indeed, as there were populations of men who had been born in Chile wishing their independence, Spain fought back fiercely and carried out ambushes and attacks to stop the idea of an independent country of Chile. Chile was part of the Spanish Empire. Hey, do you see the flag flying there? Sure does look like the Texas flag, doesn't it? But what's interesting is it was a flag created by Chilean nationalists 22 years before there was a state of Texas that developed its own flag, which does look very much like the Chilean flag. So power struggles, one after another, of Spanish reconquest, of independence, of coups d'etats, formations of confederations, attempts to pacify and to control their own ocean, finally civil war. During this period, one of the most interesting side notes occurred in 1860 when a Frenchman named Tunens would come from France to Chile, and he had been reading about the Mapuches. He was interested in seeing them and understanding them. He became fluent in their language, and he spoke with the Mapuche political leaders and convinced them that if they united, they could drive the Spanish out of Chile, and they could create in the south half of Chile literally an independent country that was going to be ruled by Mapuches, a Mapuche nation. It would include not only parts of modern-day Chile, but also parts of modern-day Argentina. And as you might imagine, neither the Spanish citizens of Argentina or of Chile were interested in having that happen. This fellow, he called himself King Antoine, by the way, would rule for a couple of years. He would be captured by the Spanish, and they had an interesting realization that if they killed him, he'd become a martyr. But they sure couldn't keep him around in prison because he could be escape or he could be freed and then lead a revolt again. So they actually sent him back to France with a tag saying he was insane. And he lived out the last part of his years in an insane asylum in Paris after having been for 2 years king of this Mapuche nation. So from backwater to economic leaders. By the turn of the century, there would be a process of forming a parliament, of forming a constitution, and of electing the first president in 1915. And you see a voting box here taken there during that election. It was during that time also that significant silver, saltpeter, but importantly, copper resources were identified in Chile that are being open pit mined. You see the open pit mine there on the left-hand side, and you see then the refining, the mill for it on the right. The wealth of these copper mines, but also saltpeter and silver, immediately began to infuse into Chile more wealth than the surrounding neighboring countries had. Now, really interesting story of the recent history of Chile relates to the political spectrum. In Chile, there had almost always been a control of the country by the Conservative Party, which was closely allied with the Catholic Church. But at the same time, there were liberal parties and there were worker socialist parties. This is true not only in Chile, but in all of the South American countries. And in an election in 1970, a medical doctor named Salvador Allende was elected. And his position, he was not part of the conservative political party. He was part of the liberal political party with sympathies towards the worker parties. And to the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States and to President Richard Nixon, this man was clearly a communist. And particularly when he began to speak about nationalizing various aspects of the Chilean economy to take control of the copper mines away from the owners and the copper companies and to make it part of the Chilean government, well, this was unacceptable. And so a military coup occurred. And Salvador Allende, depending on which story you wish to believe, either committed suicide in the presidential office or he was murdered in the presidential office. And that occurred in 1973. It's been an ongoing discussion as to, was he shot by his bodyguards? Did he shoot himself? Was he shot by a CIA operative? But at his death, a new government of generals was organized with General Augusto Pinochet ruling the country. And indeed, anyone who was viewed as liberal or labor-related were hunted down and either imprisoned or more often simply disappeared. And it was a very difficult time for Chile. During the time of the military junta, one of the questions was there had to be some form of modernization of the economy. There had to be something done to move Chile forward, but without triggering the anger of the generals in the military. So there was a group of Chilean scholars who were studying at the University of Chicago, which is why they're called the Chicago Boys, and they were studying economics and political science. And they sat down to devise and recommend to the military junta and to the parliament modernization steps that could be taken to diffuse the tensions and diffuse some of the problems that had arisen with Allende and then arisen after the coup that took him out. During this time, even in times of political unsettledness, there were still wonderful writers and poets and intellectuals. There's a history in Chile of literature that is celebrated with 2 Nobel laureates. And it is a country that's rich in culture heritage. Both it's indigenous, but also it's Hispanic. So Easter Island couldn't leave a lecture, since I'm an archaeologist, without talking about it. It's a volcanic island that's far off into the South Pacific island, and 63 square miles, which is a pretty large area for a population of 7,750. But you have to realize only a small portion of the island actually is suitable for agriculture. And much of the island is extremely rocky and bare of vegetation. The population of this island had once been many times larger, probably 3 or 4 times larger than the current population of around 7,000 to 8,000. And one of the sad things that happened was, as population grew on the island, they eventually denuded it of vegetation, and they exhausted the agricultural land. And when it was first discovered by European explorers, the island was literally in political revolution, with different communities on different edges of the island battling against their neighbors to try to get a hold of these small areas that would produce firewood and produce food. So petroglyphs, these are designs carved into the stone, one of the areas of expertise I have and one of the things I enjoy studying. We have these wonderful faces. We have many petroglyphs of birds, because there was a strong cult called the Birdman cult that apparently related to beliefs in their ability for the birds to choose sometimes those who would be the leaders of their communities, by men who were the bravest to jump like birds into the ocean water, swim to the island that you see there in the distance, gather a bird egg, and then swim back without losing it or breaking it. The first guy that could do that in a competition would be their ruler until he would be replaced. The island, Easter Island, is so famous for these amazing statues called the moai. And the statues do not face the ocean. The statues all face in towards the interior of the island. They are lined up in rows. You see how they are there. And in front of each statue, do you see that kind of rocky surface? There is a rocky platform in front of each statue. And buried inside those rocky platforms are the skeletons of the ancestors of the Easter Island individuals who settled it. And so each of those statues stands for an ancestor. And in fact, they go down deep into the earth. And the statues, many times, each statue is decorated, carved designs of what appear to be tattoos, body ornamentation, skin decoration, that must have, again, been recognizable for these different founding fathers. During the upheaval of the island, the fighting for control of land and trees, it was not uncommon for one group to come and knock over the statue of the other group, or at least knock their hats off. All the statues originally had hats, by the way, as a way of dishonoring them. It's also interesting, anywhere you find those large statues, those moai statues on the island of Rapa Nui, anywhere you find them, nearby will be a spring of fresh water, because that's also a very precious commodity on a small island where the fresh water falls as rain. It travels through the volcanic soil and bedrock, and then only in a few places does it emerge. And where those places occur, these statues are set up to honor the water and to honor their ancestors. So, Switzerland of South America. It exports $64.5 billion worth of mainly mineral products. It is one of the largest producers of copper in the world. It is very competitive. The per capita income, if you average it out across the country, is very good. There's a low perception of corruption, and that means that unlike many places in South America and Central America, you don't have to bribe a government official to get permission for anything. You simply are judged by where you stand in line for what you ask for. Now, I've got to tell you, the income inequality is very wide. And for that reason, it's suspected that around 40% of the population of Chile actually should be classified as in poverty. But 60% are within working and middle and then upper class. So we've been talking about Chile from the early Inca period, even earlier than that, the Ice Age period. Talked about the time of Spanish conquest, its early difficulty as a backwater identity because of absence of gold and silver, but its movements during the 20th century to quelch turmoil, and now becoming one of the leading economies in South America, with a flag that does look like the flag of Texas, but it's theirs. It's the unique flag of Chile. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. Welcome to my library anytime, and I'm looking forward to being back to sea with Viking just in a few weeks. I'll be in the Viking homelands, and then later on I'm going to have the privilege of being on the first sailing of the Viking Neptune, which is going to be a great excursion, being launched out of Italy to Turkey, through the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic, through the Panama Canal, and up to Los Angeles. Can you imagine? Viking has such wonderful cruises. I look forward to seeing you on one of them. Thanks for listening to my presentation.